song by Alan Zarbach, narrated via Speechlo, and presented by Midgard and Beyond Books.
Star Song by Alan Zarbach. Chapter 1. Dr. Jonathan Dunham occasionally took his eyes off his wrinkled light blue note sheets and glanced out of the portside window of the shuttlecraft. His mind boggled over the infinity of space and the countless number of stars, which spread out and glistened as if for him and him alone. He truly loved being among the stars. It was an exhilarating experience for him to be this far out in the solar system for the first time in his career. His dream, which seemed to span 1,000 lifetimes, was finally being realized. "There's just so many of them," Dr. Dunham muttered to himself. Crystal, Dr. Dunham's wife of 10 years, was reclined next to him and half asleep. She stirred a bit at the sound of his rich, soothing voice. Her eyes fluttered open and she turned to face her husband. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Crystal asked softly, snuggling into his shoulder. Dr. Dunham put an arm around his wife. His notes slid to the deck plates, but he let them remain where they had landed. Pulling Crystal to his chest, he enjoyed the sensation of being near her. "Oh, nothing," Dr. Dunham said lovingly. "I'm just thinking out loud again." Completely awake now, Crystal kissed him on his cheek, and then she nestled back into his shoulder. She looked at his notes spread out on the deck, and then she looked up into her husband's soft brown eyes. "You really should organize your notes on CD," Crystal suggested, revisiting a reoccurring discussion. "Computers are good for some things, but I still need to put my personal notes on paper. Nothing beats the feel of a pen in my hand and the sound of crinkly, crisp sheets of paper," he said, and then he brushed a golden strand of hair away from Crystal's face and kissed her forehead. "Is this your way of saying you think too spontaneously and you can't type your thoughts fast enough?" Crystal replied with a smile. Dr. Dunham reached up and switched off the cabin's overhead lights. "You know me too well." Dr. Dunham emptied his mind of thoughts about mineral and ore deposits. He emptied his mind of multi-billion-dollar mining, manufacturing, and refining operations. All that mattered was the light of Sol reflecting off Phobos and illuminating the delicate features of his beloved Crystal. Chapter 2. After 70 hours and 40 minutes of cruising through space, the shuttlecraft approached its final destination. The window beside Dr. Dunham hosted a full view of the countless asteroids that orbited the Sun between Mars and Jupiter. By the hands of Commander Lynette, the skillful shuttlecraft pilot, the spacefaring vessel maneuvered through the perilous, dense field of asteroids. Dr. Dunham gaped in awe as well as with concern while the shuttlecraft cruised dangerously close to one of the larger asteroids. On final approach, Commander Lynette's voice sounded over the intercom. "We'll be docking at Ceres Station 1 in approximately 10 minutes, Dr. Dunham. Please buckle yourselves in back there. The ride usually gets a bit rough as we pass through the protective shielding. After we're docked, I'll see to it that your personal belongings are brought to your quarters," she informed in a pleasant tone. "Thank you, Commander Lynette. Crystal and I appreciate your helpfulness," Dr. Dunham replied. Before long, the shuttlecraft hovered over the vast expanse of the illuminated, octagonal landing pad that was located in the center of Ceres Station 1. A long, tubular, pressurized tunnel extended from the landing pad, joining it with the main structure. The main structure consisted of 8 buildings with 4 levels. The buildings, each specifically designed according to its function, were evenly spaced, forming an enormous octagon on the surface of the mammoth asteroid. Each of these 8 buildings was also linked to one another by long, tubular, pressurized tunnels. Once the shuttlecraft landed, a pressurized tubular gangplank automatically attached itself to the shuttlecraft's main hatch. Dr. Dunham and Crystal clumsily pulled themselves through the zero gravity of the shuttlecraft's main cabin. When they cleared the hatch, they gripped a gnarled handrail that dragged them along the gangplank and through the tunnel, leading into the main structure of Ceres Station 1. On entering the main structure, they felt the artificial gravitational field draw their weary bodies to the deck plates. Even though the artificial gravity was only 70% of the Earth, Dr. Dunham's steps were awkward as he felt a significant portion of his body weight for the first time in nearly 3 Earth days. He and Crystal clung to one another out of both affection and exhaustion as they moved along at a slow, cumbersome pace. The station's shipping and receiving administrator, Nolan Barris, was in the reception center to greet the Dunhams when they entered Building 1. Barris was a middle-aged man, short and slender with a touch of gray hair at his temples. His eyes shifted around the reception center as if he disapproved of everyone and everything within his immediate surroundings. "Ah, Dr. Dunham, and of course your wife, Christy. I trust you both had a pleasant trip," Barris said with a slight British accent. "Yes, Crystal and I were made very comfortable," Dr. Dunham replied, already feeling a bit of dislike for Barris. Crystal was very shy when first meeting people. She simply smiled warmly and remained close to her husband's side. "That's splendid, though I personally don't care much for space travel," Barris told them. Then he straightened his extremely grotesque paisley tie. Seeming impatient, as if late for an important meeting, he added, "The heads of the survey teams are unable to greet you at this time. I'm afraid we've encountered another one of those mysterious accidents. This time 2 miners were killed and 1 miner was shaken up a bit more than slightly. He just keeps babbling on and on rather foolishly. I'm sure you know how these space bums can get. I had the nutter sedated." "Jonathan," Crystal said softly with concern as she gazed up to meet her husband's eyes. Barris gave Crystal a tired look. Dr. Dunham ignored Barris' narrow-minded remarks and chose not to comment. Instead, he inquired more about the accident. "What exactly happened? How is it 2 miners were killed?" he asked in a voice of authority. "Well, it's all the same really," Barris began. "There's structural damage being done all around the station. Nobody knows who or what is doing it. The lab has analyzed a corrosive substance found in various places where the structural damage is most evident. However, the lab has been unable to identify the composition of the substance." Dr. Dunham shook his head and said, "This station houses the best scientific minds from all of Earthside Command. I find it difficult to believe that." Barris was quick to cut Dr. Dunham off in mid-sentence. "Whatever is going on around here is not my concern, Doctor," he said in a snobbish sort of manner. "My job is to see to it that we begin shipping the natural resources mined from these asteroids as soon as possible. And need I remind you, Doctor, it is your job to find the richest mineral deposits, so the mining operations may continue to produce with maximum efficiency." Dr. Dunham had just about all he could tolerate from Nolan Barris. He gave Barris an angry look, but restrained himself from really letting Barris have a piece of his mind. "I don't think I need you to tell me what my job is, thank you," he said sternly. Crystal grabbed her husband's arm. She pulled him close and said, "Excuse me, I really would like to freshen up a bit. It was a long trip." Barris smiled a belittling little smile that annoyed Dr. Dunham severely. "Of course, ma'am," Barris replied, falsely eager to accommodate. "I'll get the station's boy to take you to your quarters while I show your husband some of the damages." "That will be fine," said Dr. Dunham, while trying to remain patient with the insufferable Nolan Barris. Barris turned, and his eyes shifted around the reception center. He clapped his hands loudly and called out, "Donnie! Donnie! Oh, will you get in here?" A tall young man with broad shoulders and a broad smile rushed up to Barris. Yes, ma Mr. Bob Barris," he stuttered while keeping his head down and his eyes focused on the deck. "Show Mrs. Dunham to her quarters, if you please," Barris said, looking hard at Donnie's soft, innocent face. "Can you handle this? Or must I get a monkey from one of the labs to do it for you?" Donnie's smile drooped, and his eyes remained on the deck. "I think I can," he paused as if with uncertainty. Then he said, "I'll do my best, sir." Crystal approached Donnie, and she gently took his arm. "We can find it together," she assured Donnie. Donnie slowly and cautiously raised his head. He looked into Crystal's lovely jade eyes, and his smile returned. "Okay," Donnie said without the slightest stammer. Barris rolled his eyes over the sight of Crystal and Donnie walking together down the corridor. Dr. Dunham wanted nothing more at the moment than to slap the eyes out of Barris's thick skull. "Right," Barris said, somewhat insistent. "I'll take you to the site of the last accident. Dr. Dunham forced a smile. He was determined not to let Barris irritate him any further. That will be a good place to begin. Chapter 3. Barris guided Dr. Dunham through Building 6 to the access hatch of Tunnel 5-6. They stood before a transparent steel door that held back the vacuum of open space. From where Dr. Dunham stood looking out into space, the asteroids seemed to outnumber the stars. There were just so many of them, and they were so dangerously close together. The only thing that prevented an asteroid collision from damaging or destroying the space station was an invisible energy field that projected from the very heart of the station and resided beneath the shuttlecraft's landing pad. Nothing on the outside, human, animal, asteroid, or machine, should have been able to penetrate the protective shielding without proper authorization, Dr. Dunham figured, while he also pondered the notion of a saboteur inside Ceres Station 1. With that thought in mind, his eyes hit the back of Barris's head. "This is it," Barris said, holding his arms out wide before the damaged tunnel. He flopped down his arms and continued to explain. The outer wall of the structure was compromised first. Then the inner wall gave way under the strain of cabin pressure. Large quantities of the corrosive substance were discovered in and around the damaged areas. Dr. Dunham was more concerned with the lost men. "Damages can be repaired, Mr. Barris. What about the mining crew?" The 2 men who died were launched into space by the sudden release in air pressure. They were just miners, so it was no big loss, Barris explained. The surviving miners somehow managed to seal off the tunnel. Seems mighty curious to me that an old codger like Murray managed to escape death when 2 younger, more competent miners could not. Very curious, Dr. Dunham muttered to himself. Then, as he continued to inspect the mangled tunnel, he asked, "Will this damaged tunnel create a problem as far as the station's normal functions?" Barris let out a bored sigh. "No," he lazily began. "It is nothing more than a terrible inconvenience. As you can see, Doctor, if one wishes to conduct business in buildings 5 or 6, one must travel around the station." "I've seen enough for now," Dr. Dunham said. Then he faced Barris. "Would it be too much trouble for you to assemble the heads of the survey teams for a conference?" After which, he turned back to study the damaged tunnel. "Oh, very well," Barris said, as if he had much more worthy tasks to occupy his time. "I'll have them meet you in the main briefing room. You'll find it in Building 3, Level 4, Section 1. Dr. Dunham turned away from the transparent steel hatch and the damage beyond. His eyes drifted over Barris's left shoulder and locked into a hard stare with the eyes of a man who suddenly appeared before him. The man's eyes were filled with total horror. For the moment, Dr. Dunham remained calm and tried to analyze the Raggedy Man's expression. Barris stepped in by clapping his hands loudly. "Murray, get back to the medical center, you daft old fool." When their initial eye contact was broken by Barris's obnoxious intrusion, Dr. Dunham noticed for the first time Murray wore a hospital gown. The elderly man trembled before them, ignoring Barris completely. He spoke directly to Dr. Dunham, as if he had known him for years. "Doc Dunham," he stated rather than asked, his voice deep and gruff. "I tell you, Doc, I seen it plain as the sun." "What did you see?" Dr. Dunham asked with growing interest in and concern for both the mysterious accidents and the trauma that would make a man appear to fall apart before his eyes. "I don't believe this bloody nonsense," Barris mumbled. Yet again he was completely ignored. "They was ghosts," Murray said with his voice quivering as his big gray eyes glazed over. "Ghosts, I tell you straight. From the crew of the shuttlecraft Adventurer they were. You know? The Adventurer be the one what crashed among these here asteroids 10 years ago. I don't know why they do it though. I just don't know why." Uncertain how to reply, Dr. Dunham said, "Thank you for the information, Mr. Murray." Murray stood on shaking legs and nodded slowly. Dr. Dunham cautiously approached Murray. "I'm sure this information may prove to be useful, but in the meantime, you should get some rest." "He should get his bloody head examined," Barris mumbled. Murray appeared to accept Dr. Dunham's sincerity. Dr. Dunham was probably the only one who would ever listen to him, but that seemed to satisfy Murray for the moment. "Yep, I try to do that, Doc," Murray said. "But there's one more thing. The bodies of Douglas and Adams were brung back and properly made fast to the Tunnel 5-6 bulkhead. Think about it, Doc. Things as small as 2 bodies lost in a storm of rocks and brung back to the station. dead but not a scratch on them. Dr. Dunham watched Murray disappear as he rounded a corner. The mysteries Murray left him with plagued his already troubled mind. Not only was he curious about how the bodies were found and returned, but he was also concerned about who or what could have found them. Searching for 2 bodies in the asteroid field would have been the equivalent of searching for a drop of fresh water within the brine of the Atlantic Ocean. The final mystery disturbed him the most. Why would anyone return the bodies and secure them to the bulkhead? Was it a show of strength or superior abilities? Or was it simply a psychological strategy to instill fear in the company, crew, and administration of Ceres Station 1? Dr. Dunham wondered. With his frustration and anger suddenly challenging his better judgment, Dr. Dunham glared at Barris. "Why didn't you tell me all of this? What Murray saw? What actually happened?" he demanded. Barris let out a humorless chuckle. "Come now, my good Dr. Dunham. Surely you don't believe that senile old nutter's story," said Barris wryly. He chuckled again. "Really, ghosts tying bodies to the bulkhead? That isn't the point, and you know it," Dr. Dunham said angrily. He stepped toward Barris, backing him into the transparent steel door. "I don't believe ghosts are our problem, but I do believe Murray actually saw someone or something out there. The dead men didn't tie themselves to the bulkhead." Barris gave an innocent shrug and said, "Well, Dr. Dunham was quick to cut him off. He didn't have any desire to listen to another word Barris had to say. "Main briefing room in 30 minutes, Barris," he ordered, hoping Barris would challenge his authority. Without giving Barris another look, Dr. Dunham turned and stomped off through Building 6. Chapter 4. Dr. Dunham and Crystal left their living quarters and headed for the main briefing room. Donnie, who helped guide the newcomers around Ceres Station 1, led the way. He seemed happy to be of service to the Dunhams. During the brief time they spent together, Dr. Dunham and Crystal learned that Donnie was the nephew of Maurice Speckman, the CEO of Milky Way Mining, Inc. Milky Way Mining was one of the 4 mining companies that had mineral, ore, and element contracts with Earthside Command. Speckman managed to get Donnie signed on to Ceres Station 1 as a general laborer along with the Milky Way mining crew. From what Dr. Dunham could figure out, Donnie gradually assumed the role of a general go-for all the station and mining personnel. Donnie appeared to enjoy his job, but it didn't take long for Dr. Dunham to notice Donnie wasn't given the proper human respect. The few personnel whom they encountered seemed to tolerate Donnie and treat him well, simply out of respect for Dr. Dunham and Crystal, rather than respect for Donnie. Crystal vowed to change that treatment of Donnie as soon as possible, and Dr. Dunham vowed to help her make it so. See, I told you I could bring you here," Donnie said excitedly as they stepped from the lift and onto level 4 of Building 3. Donnie smiled and straightened the collar of the lab coat he proudly donned. Crystal had given him one of Dr. Dunham's old lab coats as a token of their appreciation. Crystal returned the smile, and Dr. Dunham winked at Donnie. "I never doubted you, Donnie," Dr. Dunham told the young man. Donnie hastened down the corridor ahead of the others. He stopped and pointed to a plaque marked Building 3, Level 4, Section 1, Main Briefing Room. When Dr. Dunham and Crystal caught up to him, Donnie opened the pressure hatch and waved his hand across the threshold. Dr. Dunham and Crystal quickly stepped inside, and Donnie followed them and stood near the hatch after closing it. The group inside the spacious briefing room didn't notice the 3 who had just entered. The members of the group were too busy arguing among themselves over various issues surrounding their mining operations and the mysterious accidents. Tempers seemed to be heated to the boiling point. Dr. Dunham and Crystal approached the large oval table that the group of 6 was seated around. A brief moment passed, and then they received smiles of recognition from 2 familiar faces. A plump, elderly man pushed on his cane and stood, offering his hand. "Ah, Dr. Dunham, it is good to see you and Crystal again," he said, bringing the group's attention to the new arrivals. Dr. Dunham accepted the elderly man's hand with enthusiasm and delight. "Thank you, Dr. Moore," he said as he and Crystal moved closer to join the group. "We were really looking forward to seeing you and Maggie." "It's been a while, hasn't it?" said Crystal in her soft-spoken sort of way. Maggie politely stood up next to her husband and said, "It's been nearly 3 years." "Very nice indeed," Barris said from the rear of the table. "Right then, now may we proceed with business?" With no further exchange, Maggie helped her husband back into his seat. Dr. Dunham guided Crystal into the seat next to Maggie, and he stood behind her chair while gently resting his hands on her shoulders for the support he most desperately needed. For a moment, silence draped over the group, while all eyes were fixed on Dr. Dunham. During that brief time, Dr. Dunham looked from person to person and analyzed their expressions to get a feel for his audience. After mere minutes, which seemed to linger for hours, Dr. Dunham cleared his throat and said, "I guess it would be better if we all get acquainted before we get down to business." Dr. Dunham paused and received a subtle nod from each as their glances drifted from him to one another and then finally rested back on him. Looking miserably bored, Barris rolled his eyes and sank back into his chair. "I, as you all probably know, am Dr. Jonathan Dunham," he began. "I've been assigned by Earthside Command to assume the role of Chief Mining Administrator for the Ceres Station 1 Survey and Mining Cooperative, and this is my wife, Crystal." Crystal gave the group one of her warm, friendly smiles. Sitting to the right of Crystal was a young woman with short red hair and eager, glossy blue eyes. "I'm Dr. Judith Green, Universal Mining Corporation," she said. Then she gestured across the table to a tall, slender young man. "Dr. Josh Parker and I are in charge of collecting mineral and ore samples to determine the most productive mining locations," she concluded with the most professional of tones. Dr. Parker had the unsettled look of a man who was thinking of at least 100 places he'd rather be at the moment. He nervously failed to straighten his crooked bow tie and simply nodded to both Dr. Dunham and Crystal. Barris cleared his throat, let out a bored sigh, and whined. "Now that the pleasantries are over, may we get down to business so we may all get back to work. After all, Chief Mining Administrator for Ceres Station 1 for Earthside Command, you called this meeting." Dr. Dunham gave Barris a look that displayed his opinion of the man. As soon as Barris's eyes dropped to the table, Dr. Dunham officially started the meeting. "The last reports I received are 3 months old. How many mining sites have been established to date?" Dr. Dunham asked, directing the question to anyone who would feel obliged to answer. A tall, burly man in his mid-40s answered in a deep, rich voice. "We have 2 mines up and producing, 4 will be ready to begin operations within the week, and 6 more locations show potential." He leaned forward, making his chair creak under the strain of his muscular mass. "By the way, I'm Earl Spencer, the Chief Mining Engineer for Earthside Command." Dr. Dunham nodded to acknowledge Spencer. "Excellent. Your cooperative efforts have made considerable progress since the last report," said Dr. Dunham, genuinely pleased. The outstanding progress of the mining teams would give him more personal time for his private explorations and experiments. Barris abruptly took to his feet. "Was this all you wished to know? Why trouble us with a meeting when you could have read our reports?" Dr. Dunham didn't understand Barris's challenges. He hadn't been on the station long enough to have offended Barris. Dr. Dunham didn't see himself as being a personal threat to Barris either. Whatever it was that was eating at Barris was definitely real to him. Therefore, Dr. Dunham knew he must stand alert and remain constantly watchful of Nolan Barris. Stumbling a bit with his words, but not losing his momentum, Dr. Dunham dismissed Barris's comments and continued. "Now there is just one more topic I'd like to discuss." Barris let out another one of his annoying, bored sighs and dropped back into his chair. He rolled his eyes impatiently and said, "Tell me, you're not about to bring up that bloody ghost story rubbish. I assure you, Dr. Dunham, Murray's mind left him long before he started seeing ghosts." The mention of Murray's name sent a rumble throughout the briefing room. Anxious eyes, including those of Crystal, looked to Dr. Dunham for an elaboration on Barris's statements. Dr. Dunham held his temper. It was getting easier for him to let Barris's half-witted comments simply roll off, and the more Barris tried to get a rise out of him, the easier it was to remain calm. He drew in a deep, cleansing breath and said, "As you know perfectly well, some unexplained accidents have occurred in various places throughout the station. I've yet to form a solid theory as to." He paused in mid-sentence with a thought. "Truthfully, I can't even come up with anything half-crazed decent to explain what's been going on around here. Murray, the miner who survived the destruction of Tunnel 5 to 6, said he saw some things that looked like ghosts. Has anyone else witnessed anything to that effect?" Dr. Dunham waited for a comment. The members of the group silently looked at one another while shaking their heads and shrugging. but they all, except Barris, seemed to take his question seriously. Without a single comment, all eyes and vacant expressions turned back to Dr. Dunham. "Well," Dr. Dunham said at last, "I'd like all of you to keep your eyes open for anything, and I do mean anything, out of the ordinary." He paused, mainly to give Barris a less than friendly look, and then he continued, "I don't think we're dealing with ghosts. However, someone is sabotaging the station, and I believe he or she wants us to think we're dealing with ghosts or some other paranormal phenomena. If anyone finds any evidence that may cast a little light on this mystery, let me know immediately." "That won't be necessary, Dunham," said a cool, dry voice from the far right corner of the briefing room. Dr. Dunham and the others focused their attention in the direction of the speaker. A figure dressed in a long black leather overcoat slowly emerged from the shadows. Dr. Dunham was surprised to see the man appear as if by magic. The other members of the group seemed to be equally surprised. Where did he come from? Dr. Dunham wondered. The man approached the table. His body movements were smooth and subtle, as though he were floating across the deck. "You see, Dunham, this is exactly why I was assigned to this station," the man explained. He paused and flashed an identification badge before Dr. Dunham's eyes. Then he introduced himself. "Captain Len Marks, Earthside Command, Department of Investigations." "That'll do, Marks," Barris quickly interjected. "These meetings are strictly confidential, and I do wish you would stop popping in on us like this." Marks didn't give Barris the slightest fraction of his attention. He tucked his identification badge back into the inside pocket of his overcoat and said, "I'll take care of your little problem, Dunham. You can count on it. Ghosts or no ghosts, I'll find those responsible soon enough. It may very well be someone in this room." "Is that a fact?" Spencer asked through tight lips. He stood to a towering height of over 2 meters, and he began to take a step in Mark's direction. "If you came to Ceres Station 1 looking for trouble, DOI man, you found it, bud." Before Spencer could complete his first step toward the DOI man, Marks's right hand mysteriously produced a small pistol, as if out of thin air. Without the slightest bit of emotion appearing on his countenance, Marks trained the laser sight of his weapon directly on the bridge of Spencer's nose. Marks suddenly smiled humorously at his would-be challenger. "I'd stand back, folks," he snickered. "This is likely to be messy." Dr. Dunham quickly stood closer to Crystal, though he knew without a doubt that a shot from that range would tear clean through both of them. Crystal took his arm and held it close to her heart. Spencer seemed well aware of the glowing red dot trained on the target between his eyes. Whether it was fear, courage, or foolishness, Spencer held his ground. "If you think that gun scares me, you're wrong, bud," he stated. Though the entire station was climate-controlled to a precise 70 degrees Fahrenheit, sweat accumulated on Spencer's upper lip and forehead. "No, this weapon doesn't frighten you," said Marks, somewhat comically. In the wink of an eye, Marks held another pistol of a much larger caliber in his left hand. He leveled the pistol at Spencer's chest. "Perhaps this one will make you soil your shorts." Spencer dropped his head just far enough to see the red needle-point laser sight of Mark's weapon, resting steadily over his heart. Dr. Dunham believed Marks wouldn't hesitate to fire on Spencer in cold blood, and the DOI badge gave Marks the authority. Spencer's slightly trembling fists led Dr. Dunham to feel Spencer also believed that apparent fact. As the standoff took a turn for the worst, the others around the table were trembling and sweating even more than Spencer. Even Barris held his foolish tongue. The slamming of a fist onto the table startled everyone except Len Marks. He remained calm and collected with Spencer still in his weapon's sights. Dr. Dunham raised his fist from the table and stated forcefully but without anger, "This has gone far enough. Spencer, take your seat. Marks, put your weapons away. You'd have to be crazy to fire those things in here." There was a bit of hesitation displayed by both men. Then, finally, never taking his eyes off the weapons, Spencer eased down into his chair. Mark's weapons seemed to disappear from his hands as he floated back into the shadows from which he had emerged. There was a brief moment of silence while everyone tried to relax and make sense of the last few moments. After being at Ceres Station 1 for just over an hour, Dr. Dunham felt he was already getting more than he had signed on for with this assignment. It was an unsettling feeling to be losing control before he had the opportunity to take control of the mining cooperative. Dr. Dunham worked some moisture back into his dry throat and said, "Well, I guess that's all for now." Dr. Dunham glanced down at his pocket watch, more out of nervous habit than concern for the time. Crystal and I are going to finish getting settled and try to get some rest. If there are no further comments, questions, or concerns, we can continue working when the morning hours roll around." Dr. Dunham received several nods of agreement. Then, feeling the sudden fatigue brought on by the space lag, he said, "Okay, until then." Unexpectedly, Donnie muttered, I saw something." His stutter once again returned. Everyone's attention focused on the youth. Donnie became nervous and looked as if he wished everyone would stop staring at him. Dr. Dunham could see the anxiety swelling in Donnie's eyes. Donnie looked as though he was about to take flight while Dr. Dunham slowly moved closer to him. Donnie nervously shifted his weight from leg to leg. "It's all right, Donnie. Please, tell me what you saw," Dr. Dunham said in a soothing tone. Donnie seemed to forget about all the others in the briefing room. He looked deeply into Dr. Dunham's comforting eyes, and the anxiety appeared to drain from him. "I saw glowing things, big ones," Donnie said at last and without stuttering. "I don't believe this rubbish," Barris suddenly cried out. He leaned back in his chair and threw his arms up in frustration. "You people are meant to be scientists and professionals. First, it's a daffy old man. Now it's a proven dunderhead. What's next? The boogeyman? I say we drop this foolishness completely and continue with our mining projects as scheduled," insisted Barris. Donnie frowned. The tall, muscular, striking figure of the young man cowered in a corner at the sound of Barris's voice. Dr. Dunham slowly turned from Donnie to face the rest of the group. With the exception of Barris, they all looked to him in total support. Then Dr. Dunham locked eyes with Barris, who quickly turned away. "Eventually, I'll put Barris in his place, but this isn't the proper time," he told himself. With no further comments from Barris, Dr. Dunham turned back to Donnie, and he slowly approached the young man. Donnie stood tall, and his confidence seemed to return as Dr. Dunham walked closer to him. "It's all right, Donnie," Dr. Dunham assured in a whisper that only Donnie could hear. "Don't worry about that narrow-minded jackass." He cleared his throat and then spoke so all could hear. "Can you tell us more about what you saw?" Donnie smiled. The way he stood and the confident glint in his eyes showed Dr. Dunham and the rest of the group how good Donnie felt to have someone looking out for him. "Yes, I think so," Donnie said clearly and confidently. Then he was silent while he chewed his lower lip in thought. Anticipation hung heavily in the briefing room. The eyes of the room were fixed on Donnie, but Dr. Dunham purposely positioned himself to block Donnie's view of the others and their intense stares. "Take your time and concentrate on the facts," Dr. Dunham told him. Donnie closed his eyes as if gazing deeply into his mind to recall memories. He smiled suddenly as if he had found that for which he was searching. Without opening his eyes, Donnie whispered, "I can see them now, I remember. They looked like people but with tails like whales have. They glowed too, purple. Some were blue and some were even red. I like the purple ones the best." Donnie's eyes slowly opened to meet the eyes of Dr. Dunham. Donnie smiled. He seemed proud to speak and grateful to have someone genuinely listening to him. "Is there more you can tell us, Donnie?" Dr. Dunham urged. Donnie nodded and joyfully continued. "They moved around like whales too. I waved at them and said, 'Hello, whales,' but they didn't hear me. When the tunnel broke, they floated away. They looked so afraid. I was afraid too." Dr. Dunham smiled and placed a comforting hand on Donnie's shoulder. "It's perfectly okay to be afraid at times, Donnie." Donnie's whole body seemed to smile. "I liked them. They didn't want to hurt anyone, I could tell. They looked sad when the men were forced into space." Donnie's last remark was somewhat more curious than the rest. "What makes you think they were sad?" Dr. Dunham asked. "They sang a song," Donnie explained. "It was a happy song, but it changed to a sad song when the men were blown into space. The song became more sadder even when they brought the men back." Crystal, along with all the others, appeared to be quite intrigued by Donnie's tale. "What kind of song, Donnie?" she asked softly. Donnie smiled. It was obvious he liked Crystal. "Like a bird almost," Donnie told her. Then he whistled and hooted a bit. "Something like that, but prettier, lots more prettier." Dr. Dunham felt no further questions were necessary. Though Donnie's story was interesting and insightful, it did nothing more than add weak credibility to Murray's story. Dr. Dunham didn't refuse to believe what both men claimed to have seen out in space, but their stories didn't answer any of his questions. The outlandish stories just made the mystery more complicated. He had more than enough to sort out and contend with for the moment. Therefore, he decided to bring the meeting to an end and and once again call it a night. "Thank you, Donnie. You've been very helpful," Dr. Dunham said, and then he turned to address the others. "This is too much for me to cope with," barked Barris. "I believe you said goodnight a moment ago." Barris then glared at Donnie and stomped out of the briefing room while grumbling, "How can a bloody song carry through the vacuum of space? Pathetic, simply pathetic." After Barris left, Dr. Dunham dismissed the rest of the group. With Donnie as their guide, Dr. Dunham and Crystal left the briefing room arm in arm. For reasons Dr. Dunham didn't care to think about at the moment, Len Marks stayed behind. Inside a cloak of darkness, he remained seated quietly alone in a corner of the briefing room. "A flock of ghosts and a loose cannon," Dr. Dunham grumbled to himself. Chapter 5. Inside 20 Hours on Ceres Station. 1. Donnie's story about the singing ghosts haunting the asteroid field spread to all personnel with slight variations and extreme embellishments. After 3 more accidents resulting in minor wounds to the station personnel and major damages to Building 4, Level 4, some were reluctant to perform their duties outside the confines of the station, but most refused to continue working altogether, even in the labs, until the sabotage came to an end and the culprit or culprits were in official custody. Donnie wasn't to blame for the mining delays caused by the foolishness and the petty superstitions, but Barris treated the young man worse than ever. Barris had cargo shuttles arriving with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of supplies and equipment, but he was forced to send them back to Earthside void of the natural resources the Earth was desperate to receive. The station personnel pressured Dr. Dunham for results, and Barris was among the worst of the chronic complainers. Periodically, Dr. Dunham tried to set everyone's fears to rest, but then each accident occurred in turn, leaving all in a state of panic. As a result, many of the scientists submitted their requests for assignment transfers. Dr. Dunham appealed to Len Marks for rapid results. "The situation is growing more desperate by the hour," he said while cornering Marks in the galley. "I agree," Marks replied, picking at a synthetic baked potato. "Why is it, Marks, you never seem to be around when an accident occurs? And whenever you do grant us the honor of investigating the site of an accident, you clearly exhibit nothing more than idle curiosity." Marks pushed his mutilated potato aside and stared right through Dr. Dunham, as though the good doctor were nothing more than one of the station's many viewports. "I'm afraid I must insist that you disclose the leads you have on solving this case," Dr. Dunham demanded, while struggling to remain calm. As usual, though, Marks said nothing before he stood and strolled away from Dr. Dunham. Chapter 6. Dr. Dunham clung to the inside wall of a large fissure within an asteroid. His task of collecting rock samples was almost completed. It was nearly 10 years since he had the opportunity to do any fieldwork of this nature. The closest he had come to fieldwork was the Earthside Command mining and agricultural operation on the moon. Even then, the other scientists suited up and collected the samples. He just supervised and inspected the labs along with performing his tedious administrative duties. This time, he suited up mainly to ease the fears of the other scientists regarding the space ghosts, as they were commonly referred to by the station personnel. He also suited up because this was the opportunity of a lifetime for him. Never again would he get the chance to do this sort of first-hand work. Thus far, the asteroid proved to be a mineralogist's dream. Previous analyses revealed large traces of many known and unknown minerals, all of which were desperately needed back on Earth. Dr. Dunham was confident the new samples would prove to be just as valuable. Looking up from the deep crevice, Dr. Dunham called out, "Dr. Parker, Josh, where are you?" Dr. Dunham heard Josh's voice over the intercom, which was built into the headgear of his spacesuit. "I'm up here, just above you on the outer rim of the fissure. I just finished installing the homing beacon," Josh said nervously. Dr. Dunham spun around awkwardly in the weightlessness of open space until he spotted Josh. The young doctor waved a nervous hand. Dr. Dunham was proud of Josh's courage. The young, bright-eyed doctor was one of only 3 out of the 6 scientists still willing to battle his or her fear of the ghosts and collect rock samples. By Josh's and his own example, Dr. Dunham hoped to get the other scientists, engineers, and miners back to work. "Okay, I see you, Josh. Take your samples back to the crew transport, but don't forget to test the homing beacon's signal. I don't want to lose track of this asteroid," Dr. Dunham ordered. "I'll meet you there in a few minutes." This fissure is pretty deep. I want to get some samples from deeper inside. I think I may have discovered a vein of platinum." Josh nodded and said, "Roger that, but be careful, Dr. Dunham." The fear in his voice was definitely apparent. "There's no telling what's out here." Dr. Dunham's smile was transmitted with his voice over the intercom. "And that's exactly why we're out here, Dr. Parker. You have to let your spirit of adventure and thirst for knowledge run freely among the stars." Josh gave Dr. Dunham a salute. Then Josh engaged the booster rockets of his propulsion unit. The miniature engines flared to life, emitting a hearty roar and a bright blue flash. Josh soon disappeared as he rocketed across the perilous field of asteroids. Unexpectedly, a fluorescent purple glow captured Dr. Dunham's attention. He looked below in an attempt to locate the source. Nothing, he prematurely concluded. The fluorescent purple glow was gone, or perhaps he hadn't seen anything at all. He held his position inside the fissure and pressed a button on the control unit strapped to his wrist. A soft yellow light projected from the peak of his headgear, filling the fissure with a hazy yellow-orange glow. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he resumed his climb down into the very heart of the asteroid. As Dr. Dunham's journey continued, the fissure gradually narrowed, suggesting the bottom was near. He was about to stop his descent, and then, oddly enough, the jagged, narrowing walls of the fissure came to an end, giving way to a large tunnel. He examined the tunnel in awe. It was completely round, smoothed to perfection, and about 2 meters in diameter. There was no possible way it could have been created naturally. His mind boggled over the intriguing discovery, and all thoughts of collecting samples were set aside. Suddenly, the creeping horror snuck up on Dr. Dunham and triggered a brief panic. He awkwardly scrambled up the side of the fissure. All he could think about was getting to the crew transport before the ghosts arrived. He was near the rim of the fissure when the absurdity of his actions hit him. Stopping just below the rim, he caught his breath. Ever so slowly, he glanced down into the fissure. The light from his headgear penetrated the darkness, but it did not illuminate the fissure far enough for him to see the tunnel. "Space ghosts, only in the space between my ears," he muttered. Suddenly, the fluorescent purple light reappeared. It flashed below him, deeper inside the fissure. Dr. Dunham snapped to attention, and his body froze while he clung to the wall of the fissure. His heart began to pound, echoing in his headgear. He took a deep breath, trying to relax, but he nearly choked on the stale air. The light flashed again, and he felt a cold chill creep along the back of his neck and spine. "There's no question about it," he thought. "Something is deep in this asteroid, taunting me, or perhaps luring me, to my doom." Confronted with fear and uncertainty, yet strengthened by his spirit, Dr. Dunham continued to venture deeper into the fissure and through the mysterious tunnel. As he glided along the smooth surface of the tunnel, he pressed several buttons on his control unit. Next to his right ear, several soft beeps sounded, confirming the activation of his multi-recorder. The device was located over his right shoulder, and it commenced to record audio and video of everything he encountered, down to the last detail. He couldn't help but feel he was on the verge of something extraordinary. Just in front of him, the tunnel opened to the frontier of space. Dr. Dunham's hopes of solving the ongoing mystery of the ghosts were dashed. Through the tunnel opening, all he could see were the vast field of asteroids and an infinite number of stars. "Damn," Dr. Dunham muttered under his breath. He decided he had wasted enough valuable time and should get back to work. He attempted to contact the crew transport to inform his associates of his delayed arrival, but failed to establish a communication link. Something was interfering with his transmission. It must be the high volume of metals in the asteroid, he figured. He propped his feet against the curved wall of the tunnel and pushed as hard as he could. The momentum launched him free and clear of the asteroid. Floating in open space, he hoped to be clear of all signal interference. "Transport Commander, this is Dr. Dunham. Come in, Lynette. Can you read me?" Dr. Dunham said into the intercom of his headgear. At first, he received nothing but static. Then a voice sounded inside his headgear. "I read you loud and clear, Doctor. Where are you?" "Josh came back over 15 minutes ago. We started to get a little worried when we failed to reach you," Commander Lynette said with apparent concern. "Everything here is okay," Dr. Dunham said, still a bit frustrated with himself. "I'm on my way back now. I'll see you in 15 minutes. "Roger and out, Doctor," Lynette replied. Dr. Dunham looked beyond the asteroids and gazed at the stars. He studied them for a moment to locate the crew transport's position. He could have easily used the homing device built into his spacesuit, but he preferred to rely on his knowledge of the universe to guide him. Just as he pinpointed the crew transport's position, Dr. Dunham began to hear a mysterious, lingering siren of sorts. Figuring it was some sort of cosmic interference being picked up by his headgear, he switched off his intercom. Nevertheless, the siren continued to sound. This is impossible. Sound can't travel through space like this, he figured. Regardless of logic, the siren became louder and clearer. It seemed to take on a definite pattern, or rhythm, like thousands of people half whistling and half humming in concert. At first, Dr. Dunham was frightened by the mere presence of the song as he was reminded of Donnie's tale. The ghosts sang when they attacked the station, he thought. However, the song didn't sound in the least bit threatening. It flowed through the stars, filled his soul, and soothed his troubled mind. The song grew even louder, appearing to radiate from everywhere. He continued to look in every possible direction, but found nothing to which he could connect the song. A multitude of lights flickered and danced among the asteroids like the colorful, flashing twinkle lights of a Christmas tree. The lights were spread out in every direction, and without question, they were rapidly swarming toward him. In a matter of seconds, thousands or even hundreds of thousands of glowing ghost-like creatures surrounded him. Dr. Dunham's eyes widened in both excitement and fear, but his scientific training prevailed as he analyzed the extraordinary entities. The upper portions of the entities' bodies were somewhat humanoid in shape, having 2 arms and oval-shaped heads that gradually blended into wide, muscular shoulders. Their eyes were sparkling orbs the size of apples that pulsated along with the rhythm of their song. He couldn't detect any ears or noses, but their mouths reminded him of those he had seen in pictures of stingrays. The lower torsos of the entities were long and slender, resembling a whale's tail as they thrashed from front to back. Dr. Dunham discovered that the entities thrashed about in the vacuum of space without the apparent need for protective clothing or breathing apparatuses. Several of the illuminated entities separated from the glittering swarm. Each moving through space as easily and gracefully as a whale cutting through water, they formed a tight circle around Dr. Dunham. In one massive meteor shower of thoughts and emotions, Dr. Dunham cried out, "Who are you? What is it you want?" Their song changed briefly to mimic the pattern of his tone and the inflections in his voice. Then, just as before, the song continued, but on a much softer note. "They heard me?" he thought. Then he shouted, "You mock me." The entities surrounding him responded with another change in their song. A smile widened across Dr. Dunham's face. He couldn't keep a warm sensation from filling his heart. The feeling took hold of his soul as he became captivated by the wondrous creatures in their song. One of the entities moved away from the others within the circle and floated closer to him. Dr. Dunham could hardly contain his excitement, which managed to suppress most of his fears. "What should I do?" he asked himself over and over. Dr. Dunham's eyes met with the glowing orbs of the entity. The entity appeared to sense Dr. Dunham's anxiety and slowly extended a webbed hand toward him. Dr. Dunham extended his trembling hand as if his hand were moving forward on its own accord. Contact between the 2 sentient beings was established. Dr. Dunham shivered slightly as a burst of energy raced throughout his body. He felt a tingling sensation as the entity reached into his mind. At first, Dr. Dunham wanted to withdraw from the intrusion, but the entity's physical hold on him, though gentle, was strong enough to prevent him from reeling back. As he relaxed his body as well as his mind, he decided to follow the entity's lead. Gradually, the thoughts and emotions of both were interwoven as the entity's consciousness entered Dr. Dunham's mind like a pure, white, thick liquid light. As if one being had been formed by their merger, Dr. Dunham exchanged total joy, bliss, and acceptance with the entity. Fear from both Dr. Dunham and the entity drifted away into deep space. Amid their magical union, sorrow and regret were projected from the entity's heart. Dr. Dunham felt his expression change slightly as he concentrated on the new wave of passions that were seizing him. Somehow he knew the entity grieved for the human lives its fellow beings had accidentally destroyed. They didn't have any way of knowing the tragic outcome of their actions. In return, Dr. Dunham extended his remorse for the intrusion of the company, crew, and administrators of Ceres Station 1 into the realm of these beings. "This asteroid belt is your domain," Dr. Dunham breathed. After the thoughts and feelings of both had been shared, the entity released Dr. Dunham's mind, and then his hand. Slowly, the entity drifted away. It circled Dr. Dunham once before, rejoining its companions in their glorious song. The smaller detachment of entities swam through space to join the larger swarm. They blended among the others so quickly that Dr. Dunham lost track of them among the masses. The song followed the entities as they soared toward the more distant asteroids. At irregular intervals, as the swarm began to disperse, Dr. Dunham felt many of the entities gently reaching out to his mind and touching his heart. He continued to observe them, and he felt more than a little compelled to rocket after them. Then, by the hundreds, they disappeared among the asteroids. A sharp beeping resounded inside Dr. Dunham's headgear. It was the crew transport's emergency signal. His mind snapped to attention as if being awakened from an extraordinary dream. He breathed deeply before switching on his intercom to acknowledge the signal. "Dunham here," he eventually replied. "Commander Lynette, do you copy?" "Affirmative, Dr. Dunham. I read you," said Commander Lynette with obvious concern in her tone. "You turned off your intercom. Are you all right?" "Yes, Lynette, I'm fine," Dr. Dunham assured her. "Actually, I'm better than fine." He paused with a thought, and then he said, "I'll meet you on the outer edge in 15 minutes. This time, Lynette, I'll be there without delay." "Acknowledged. But this time, I'm going to track every centimeter of your approach. Transport out." On entering the crew transport, Dr. Dunham shed his propulsion unit, removed his headgear, and fastened the headgear strap to his belt. He avoided all questions from Lynette and Josh, and immediately took a seat next to a video display monitor. He sat alone and watched the digital footage 3 times before the crew transport reached Ceres Station 1. Each time Dr. Dunham watched the footage, he found it to be more marvelous than the previous viewing. Chapter 7. Once the crew transport docked at the station, Dr. Dunham didn't waste any time requesting an assembly of the entire company, crew, and administrators of Ceres Station 1. He informed all 65 of the station's personnel that he would address them within the hour. All were instructed to remain near their station broadcasting monitors or to assemble in one of the 9 briefing rooms. Dr. Dunham dashed into his quarters and took Crystal by the hand. "Come on," he said, pulling Crystal along. "I have something wonderful to share with everyone." His excitement sparked Crystal's curiosity, and she eagerly ran along the side of him. "What is it?" Crystal asked, struggling to keep up. "It's too difficult to explain right now. You'll just have to see it for yourself," Dr. Dunham explained. "Why don't you at least take a moment to get changed out of your spacesuit?" Crystal asked as they rounded a corner. "It must be terribly uncomfortable." "I'll do it later, Crystal. This is too important to put off," Dr. Dunham insisted as he pulled his wife through the corridor, leading to the main briefing room. He handed her his headgear. "Here, will you hold this for me, please?" Crystal took the headgear and said, "I've seen this look in your eyes many times before." Near the entrance to the briefing room, Dr. Dunham and Crystal jogged past Donnie. The young man was leaning against a wall with his head hung low. Barris must have been making Donnie feel incompetent as usual, Dr. Dunham figured. Though he was caught up in the excitement of the moment, he resolved right on the spot that he would put Barris in his place once and for all, even if that meant getting Barris assigned to another station. "If Barris even looks at Donnie funny when all is said and done, I will personally stuff Barris into the first shuttlecraft bound for Earthside," he vowed. Crystal noticed Donnie's gloomy mood at once. "Hey, Donnie," she said with motherly affection. Recognizing the voice, Donnie looked up with a complete change of mood. "Come and join us," Crystal shouted over her shoulder. "Yeah, Donnie," Dr. Dunham added, "I have something wonderful to show everyone." A smile brightened Donnie's face. He shoved himself away from the wall and followed closely behind Dr. Dunham and Crystal as they ran. Entering the main briefing room, Building 3, Level 4, Section 1, Crystal and Donnie took a seat at the large oval table while Dr. Dunham took the floor. Most of the science teams had already assembled, and they seemed to be impatiently waiting for Dr. Dunham's arrival. No one moved or made a sound as each waited in anticipation for what Dr. Dunham deemed so important that he called a complete station assembly. In several other briefing rooms throughout the station, many others had their eyes trained on monitors that would soon broadcast Dr. Dunham's urgent message. Dr. Dunham cleared his throat and went straight to the point. "I saw something extraordinary while collecting samples," he began. "I have it all recorded here." He waved the CD in front of his captivated audience. "I won't trouble you with any more words. The CD will speak for itself." Dr. Dunham rushed over to the wall on his left and pressed several buttons on a small control panel. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a large viewing screen. He inserted his CD into the video drive. Once activated, the CD began to play Dr. Dunham's incredible journey inside the fissure of the asteroid. Almost immediately, Barris shot up and protested. "Come now, what does this rubbish have to do with our meticulously planned schedule? Need I remind you, Dr. Dunham, that we do have a quota to meet? Since you arrived, production has tapered down to practically nothing. If I must send another shuttlecraft back to Earth with an inadequately filled or empty cargo hold, I will contact Earthside Command and see to it personally that the authorities demand your bloody resignation." Before Dr. Dunham could comment on his behalf, several people in the room, including Donnie, hushed Barris. Barris glared at them all individually. Before quietly sitting, Barris stared down Donnie the longest. Nevertheless, Donnie's mood wasn't spoiled as he turned his attention back to Dr. Dunham. "Everyone, please, just bear with me for a moment," Dr. Dunham implored. Finally, the footage on the CD reached its high point. Every soul in the station witnessed Dr. Dunham's awe-inspiring contact with the alien life forms. "Notice how they mimic my speech patterns as if they're trying to speak our language," Dr. Dunham pointed out, brimming with delight. "Also, notice how they're clinging to the asteroids and secreting the pasty substance from their mouths. They're feeding on the mineral deposits. This explains the damage around the station. They meant no harm. They didn't have any idea there would be lethal consequences." When the recording came to an end, a profound silence lingered over the entire station. All were mesmerized by the footage of the alien beings. Dr. Dunham's eyes wandered from person to person seated around him. He absorbed their wonderful reactions, which ranged from fear to excitement. After a moment of reflection, Dr. Dunham switched off the view screen. He carefully placed the stainless steel CD into a padded aluminum jewel case, and then he tucked the case safely into the hip pocket of his spacesuit. Suddenly, a thought jumped into Dr. Dunham's head. "I have a feeling they won't feed on the structure of our station anymore," he assured. "I wouldn't wager on that. Once a parasite, always a parasite," Barris commented, directing his disgust mainly at Dr. Dunham. Dr. Dunham controlled the rage that began to swell inside his chest. To steady himself, he gripped the backrest of Crystal's chair. "They," Dr. Dunham said through clenched teeth, "are not parasites. This CD footage proves they're a form of intelligent life. I'm certain future observations will prove they're as intelligent, or perhaps even more intelligent than humans." Barris folded his arms across his chest. "Mere speculation," he said dryly. "Yeah, well, it's speculation enough for me to postpone our mining operations until Earthside officials review this CD." Furious at the notion, Barris sprang to his feet. "This is bloody nonsense. This operation is more important. Earthside Industries must have these resources," Barris insisted. "Earthside Command should be contacted, all right? The military branch, that is. These things must be herded up and run off or exterminated like any other parasites." Dr. Dunham stood towering over Barris, and then he jabbed Barris in his chest with an angry finger. "Who are you trying to fool, Barris? Everyone in the station knows you could care less about the needs of Earth. Your only concern is the money you'll make off your investments in the mining cooperative." Barris attempted to speak, but Dr. Dunham turned his back on him. With nothing more left to say to Barris or anyone else in the briefing room, Dr. Dunham stormed out of the briefing room and down the corridor. Crystal, accompanied by Donnie, immediately followed. "Jonathan," Crystal called out as she ran to catch up with him. Without breaking stride, Dr. Dunham turned to her and said, "Crystal, go to our quarters and lock yourself inside until I get there. Secure the emergency hatch." Donnie finally caught up to them. "I'll make sure she gets there, Dr. Dunham, sir," he said, full of confidence. "Good man," Dr. Dunham told Donnie as he patted him on his back. "Go now, quickly. Don't stop running until you get there, and don't leave or open the emergency hatch until I get back." Without second-guessing the urgency of the situation, Crystal tossed Dr. Dunham his headgear. "Here," she said with eyes of love and concern. "Be careful." Dr. Dunham clipped the headgear to his utility belt. He pulled Crystal close and kissed her, filling the kiss with all his love. Crystal's one kiss was enough to give him the strength and confidence he needed to face any challenge. Reluctantly, Dr. Dunham took a step back from Crystal. "We better hurry. I'll see you shortly." Crystal nodded and said, "I love you." Dr. Dunham blew his beloved wife a passionate kiss and said, "I love you too, sweetheart." Crystal and Donnie ran down the corridor toward the living quarters. Dr. Dunham, in turn, headed straight for Tunnel 3-4, beginning his race to the Long-Range Communications Center, located in Building 5, Level 4. Like a rat poking its head out from a potato sack, Barris stuck his head into the corridor and shouted after Dr. Dunham, "Don't be a fool, Dunham. If you have any good sense, you'll destroy that CD." Chapter 8. Dr. Dunham never bothered to look back as he stepped into Tunnel 3-4. Building 4 was only 50 meters away, but the distance seemed to span the universe. Random footsteps echoed throughout the tunnel along with Dr. Dunham's own. It sounded like several people were rushing toward him. Looking over his shoulder, he couldn't see anyone because the curvature of the tunnel prevented him from seeing more than 5 meters ahead of himself or 5 meters behind himself. Not taking any chances, he quickened his pace to a jog. The racing footfalls grew even louder and more urgent, and Dr. Dunham started to hear the indistinct rumbling of voices that echoed toward him like an irate avalanche. At a full sprint, Dr. Dunham entered Building 4, just one building and one tunnel away from his destination. He sealed the access hatch to Tunnel 3-4 and used his private security code to set the lock. To ensure that no one could override his security code, he smashed the control panel with his headgear. Sparks erupted, filling the air with yellow and blue smoke and the foul smell of smoldering circuitry. As the smoke cleared, Dr. Dunham peered through the transparent steel window of the hatch. He could see the unmistakable fury masked on the faces of the 6 miners in Tunnel 3-4 who were in pursuit of him. From the looks of this mob, they mean business, he believed. The close brush with the brutality of that mob, or even worse, sent a shiver the length of Dr. Dunham's skeleton. The sensation lingered in his chest like a lead balloon as his thoughts went out to Crystal and Donnie. Crystal had a strong spirit unmatched by any soul Dr. Dunham had ever known, and Donnie had more heart and intelligence than the others credited to him. Dr. Dunham had confidence and faith that Crystal and Donnie had reached their quarters safely and secured the compartment against intruders. After giving the unruly mob of miners a cold smile, Dr. Dunham continued his race to the communication center. Since Tunnel 5-6 had previously been cut off by the aliens, that left only one route open through the station, the route he had just sealed off. The only way the miners or anyone else could reach the communication center and stop him would be through the station's shuttlecraft departure and boarding center. Nevertheless, by that time, he would have already sent his transmission to Earthside Command. The intercom inside Dr. Dunham's headgear began to emit static, followed by a muffled transmission. He turned up the headgear's volume, catching the very end of a message. Barris's voice came over clear and concise. "That's excellent. I'll try to seal off the tunnels leading into the communication center. Then I'm heading straight for the shuttlecraft. I plan to inform Earthside Command of Dr. Dunham's brutal death caused by the strange alien life forms." He paused to chuckle a bit. "That should bring the military branch of Earthside Command here in force. Barris out." "Damn him," cursed Dr. Dunham, once again thinking of Crystal and Donnie's safety before his own. While wondering with whom Barris was plotting, Dr. Dunham pushed himself even harder, quickening his pace. His heart pounded violently inside his chest and his lungs burned as he ran through the maze of corridors inside Building 4. Looking about, he had expected to encounter at least a few station personnel. He also expected to be challenged. Nonetheless, the station was as vacant as a derelict space vessel. Those who are in support of my position to halt the mining operations are probably in hiding, for good reason. Those who oppose my position might be anywhere, lurking about independently or in organized mobs, he thought, feeling very much alone in his quest. As Dr. Dunham hastened around a corner, a blunt object unexpectedly crashed down on his right shoulder, just missing his head, but grazing his ear. Before he knew what hit him, he stumbled forward, falling to his knees and wincing in pain. His eyes started to tear as he strained to focus them. Clutching his throbbing and quite possibly broken collarbone, he turned to face his assailant. The image slowly became somewhat identifiable. To Dr. Dunham's ill-fated surprise, Earl Spencer looked down on him, appearing quite pleased with himself. In his right hand, Spencer hefted a thick section of aluminum pipe just under a meter in length. Chapter 9. Spencer raised the pipe, intending to deliver the fatal blow. His mind still a bit clouded, but with his eyes finally clear, Dr. Dunham held up a hand and shouted, "Wait!" He didn't intend to beg for his life. He just needed to buy some time to weigh his options, if any options existed. Spencer lowered his pipe. "Just one well-placed blow and it'll all be over, Dunham. You won't even know what hit you. I promise," Spencer said, his eyes as emotionless as an ocean predator. Dr. Dunham slowly stood and discreetly gripped the strap of his headgear. "How can you do this, Spencer? Those are living beings out there. Use your better judgment." He paused with his head still spinning, his temples throbbing and his shoulder wound stinging. He drew in a few deep breaths and continued to reason with Spencer. If we continue to mine these asteroids, we may endanger or bring about the extinction of an intelligent form of life. Without warning, Spencer thrust his pipe into Dr. Dunham's stomach. Dr. Dunham was forced back into the wall of the corridor. He held his stomach, struggling to regain his breath and to keep from vomiting. "Don't give me that bleeding heart crap," Spencer snapped. "If this mining operation is successful, I can rocket back to Earth and retire a young and very rich man. All I have to do is kill you, destroy that CD of yours, throw your lifeless carcass out into deep space, and then reap the rewards of the mines." Spencer let a devilish grin surface, giving Dr. Dunham the impression that Spencer was a man who truly loved his work. "Oh, I'm sure you'll be happy to know your alien friends will take complete credit for my handiwork." Still trying to master his pain, Dr. Dunham continued to reason with Spencer. "Don't be a fool. Nothing good will come of this." Spencer smiled a hateful smile and swung his pipe. Dr. Dunham managed to avoid the attack and swung his headgear with all his might. Spencer took the hit square in his right shoulder and staggered back slightly. Dr. Dunham seized the opportunity to run. The hit from the lightweight headgear angered Spencer more than it injured him. He violently slammed his pipe into the wall of the corridor and then chased after Dr. Dunham. Dr. Dunham managed to reach Tunnel 4-5 without Spencer catching up to him. His final destination was just at the end of the tunnel. Never breaking stride, he pressed onward. When the hatch to Building 5 was only a few meters away from him, it suddenly slid shut before Dr. Dunham. Frantically, his fingers stabbed at the hatch's control panel. However, his access codes had been overridden. He was caught in a lethal trap. "Damn that Barris!" Dr. Dunham cursed. Spencer was merely a few meters behind him now. Dr. Dunham looked about for a weapon or something to use as a shield against the aluminum pipe, but the vacant tunnel yielded no such luck. Spencer was casually strolling through Tunnel 4-5 toward Dr. Dunham. In time with each step, Spencer continually slammed his aluminum pipe into the wall of the tunnel, chipping away fragments of concrete. Dr. Dunham spied a maintenance access hatch. In one last desperate play to escape certain death, he donned his headgear and opened the small hatch. The hatch opened to a compact, two-person pressurization and decontamination chamber designed for maintenance personnel. He hoped to find a propulsion unit, but the chamber contained only a scattering of tools and a variety of spare parts. Nervously, he fumbled with the controls. Seconds later, a green indicator light flashed. It was safe to open the hatch, giving him access to outer space. Chapter 10. Once in the vacuum of space, Dr. Dunham held fast to a maintenance ladder that ran the length of Tunnel 4-5. As quickly as possible, he pulled himself toward the nearest maintenance access hatch leading into Building 5. While constantly looking over his shoulder, he worked the controls, and the hatch opened. Hastily, on entering the compact pressurization and decontamination chamber, he positioned himself before the control console and ran the program through the cycle. Inside Building 5, Dr. Dunham immediately discovered he had entered a large storage compartment, which was packed to the rim with supplies. He clipped his headgear to his utility belt and looked about the compartment. As he worked his way to the rear of the compartment, he realized he couldn't hide among the supplies for too long. It would be only a matter of minutes before Spencer would figure out how he had evaded the trap and where he was hiding. He also imagined Barris was already in the shuttlecraft and preparing to launch any second. The sound of hydraulics reached Dr. Dunham's ears. Spencer just opened the main hatch to the storage compartment, he figured. The hydraulics sounded again as the hatch closed. "I know you're in here, Dunham," Spencer said as he moved through the storage compartment. "It's useless to hide. The harder you make it for me, the harder I'll make it for you." Dr. Dunham huddled behind several storage canisters that were stacked in a corner next to a shuttlecraft docking port. As he peered through the rows of shelves and shipping crates, he could see Spencer moving closer. "A weapon. Find something you can use for a weapon," he demanded of himself. His eyes darted from side to side in a frantic effort as adrenaline burned like acid in his veins. Weaving around the compartment, Spencer crept closer and closer until he finally stood in front of the canisters. Dr. Dunham's breathing instinctively came to a halt. There was no doubt in his mind Spencer would find him in any second. By chance, Dr. Dunham noticed a cargo restraining belt coiled by his left foot. Ever so quietly, he picked up the coil and unraveled it. He wrapped one end tightly around his left hand and let the other end, fast to a large steel restraining clasp, hang loosely at his side. Heart pounding and hands shaking, Dr. Dunham was ready to battle for his life. The first strike was his only advantage. "I have to make it count," he told himself. As a new surge of energy filled him, Dr. Dunham breathed deeply and then leaped from his hiding place while he flailed the belt. Spencer caught the first strike of the clasp on the side of his head. Blood spewed from his right ear as he dropped to one knee. Keeping with his forward momentum, Dr. Dunham continued his desperate advance. He prepared to deliver yet another blow, but Spencer had recovered too quickly from the initial attack. His pipe came out of nowhere and crashed into the side of Dr. Dunham's right knee. The thin padding of the spacesuit did very little to absorb the force of the blow, and Dr. Dunham's leg collapsed, nearly taking him to the deck. He clung to a rack of shelves to keep his balance as he continued to swing the belt madly. Spencer took a hit to his jaw that left him with a severe gash. His jaw bled copiously as he slapped a hand to his wound. Crazed anger exploded in Spencer's eyes as he thrust his pipe into Dr. Dunham's ribs. Unable to bear the crushing pain, Dr. Dunham fell to his knees with his breath bashed out of his lungs. Spencer's face twisted with evil rage as blood and spittle ran down his chin. He threw his pipe aside and grabbed a fistful of Dr. Dunham's spacesuit. "I was going to make this quick and painless, Dunham, but now you're going to pay," Spencer snarled, bringing his free hand up to his blood-soaked ear. "You won't get away with this," Dr. Dunham exclaimed as he tried to wiggle free of Spencer's grip. "It's been great working with you, Doctor," Spencer hissed with a malevolent grin. Howling with delight, Spencer slammed his fist into Dr. Dunham's stomach several times. Then Spencer finished his first series of attacks by slugging Dr. Dunham across the left side of his face. Dr. Dunham was thrown to the deck by the force of the last blow. Before Dr. Dunham's head could clear, Spencer grabbed him by the nape of his spacesuit and brutally flung him across the storage compartment. Dr. Dunham's battered body bowled over a stack of storage canisters. Spencer grabbed Dr. Dunham before he could recover his wits or his feet, and then hurled him into the steel frame of the docking port hatch. Spencer's hideously evil laughter echoed in Dr. Dunham's ears. As he pushed himself up from the deck, Dr. Dunham's arms moved with poor coordination, and the pain in his back and shoulder was unbearable. He shook his head in a desperate attempt to clear his vision and his mind. Slowly, the image of Spencer, once again holding his aluminum pipe, painfully came into focus. Desperate to get his feet underneath himself, Dr. Dunham felt a strong vibration rumble through the deck plates of the station. He cursed to himself, "Damn! The shuttlecraft! I'm too late." Frantically, Dr. Dunham pulled at his headgear and freed it from his utility belt. He still experienced a considerable lack of coordination in his hands, and his right arm was practically useless. Nonetheless, with tremendous effort, he bit back his pain and managed to fit the headgear securely over his head. Spencer laughed. "That headgear won't help you one bit. If anything, it'll only prolong your beating." Spencer continued to laugh viciously as he moved in for the kill. Dr. Dunham was grateful for the lower gravitational pull within the station. Had he been on Earth, he doubted he would have had the strength to rise. Hoping to steal enough time to clear his mind and get on his feet, Dr. Dunham continued to pretend to plead with Spencer. "Barris is already in the shuttlecraft. I guess it's over. I lost. I can accept defeat. Why don't you just let me go?" Dr. Dunham said, nearly to his feet, though still dizzy with pain. Spencer snorted an indifferent chuckle in reply. Mastering his pain, Dr. Dunham's false plea for mercy rambled on. "I'll just disappear from here with my wife, and Barris can tell Earthside whatever he likes." "What kind of fool do you take me for, Dunham?" Spencer sniggered. Bringing a hand to his bleeding chin, he shook his head and continued. "Time for negotiation is over. Besides, you, your wife, and that pain-in-the-ass Donnie are going to disappear anyway." Though a bit shaky on his feet, Dr. Dunham stood, supporting himself against the frame of the docking port hatch. "This is cold-blooded murder," he declared, hoping Spencer would still think he was begging for his life rather than stalling for time. "You're going to regret doing this." Apparently both amused and empowered by possessing the upper hand in the confrontation, Spencer twirled the aluminum pipe around his fingers as he closed in on Dr. Dunham. "Get ready to die!" Dr. Dunham composedly looped the retraining belt around a section of the docking port's frame, and then he fastened the clasp to his utility belt. His movements were so discreet they went unnoticed by Spencer, who was becoming increasingly more pleased with himself. "You honestly don't regret this, do you?" Dr. Dunham stated, truly believing it. Spencer pretended to ponder the thought for merely a second or so, and then he simply replied, "No." Dr. Dunham peered into Spencer's insanely wild eyes. Then Dr. Dunham breathed deeply and said, "Well, I don't regret this either then." "Boo-hoo," Spencer said as he advanced for the easy kill. Dr. Dunham leaped to his right, using the last of his strength. Spencer was taken completely off his guard. He jumped back, raising his pipe in defense. However, Dr. Dunham didn't attack him or even attempt to flee. For a split second, Spencer seemed baffled, and then his eyes widened with horror when he suddenly discovered Dr. Dunham's true intentions. He leaped toward Dr. Dunham in an attempt to stop him, but Spencer never stood a chance. By quickly pressing a short combination of buttons on the docking port's control panel, Dr. Dunham opened the shuttlecraft docking hatch. The instantaneous change in the compartment's air pressure forced Spencer out into the vacuum of space. Tethered to the docking port's frame, Dr. Dunham struggled to stay inside the compartment as it depressurized. Several seconds later, which seemed to span a lifetime, the storage compartment completely depressurized. Dr. Dunham pressed his weary, weightless body against the bulkhead of the station and took a moment to catch his breath and to meditate on the pain pulsing from his wounds. As he gathered his strength, he noticed the insignificant speck of Earl Spencer's lifeless body, still clutching the aluminum pipe, floating aimlessly toward the thick of the asteroid field. Dr. Dunham shivered slightly over the thought of his narrow escape. Though battered and bruised, Dr. Dunham pulled himself together and pressed onward. "I've gone too far to be defeated by Barris now. Exposing this conspiracy is the only thing that will save the lives of Crystal, Donnie, and me," he thought. Dr. Dunham floated through the docking port as quickly as he could manage. He knew it would take more time than he possessed to seal and pressurize the storage compartment, so the alternate route outside the station was his best chance. Outside the station, he sealed the shuttlecraft docking port. Then, with the aid of zero gravity, he moved along the exterior wall of Building 5. He used a large power conduit to drag himself steadily up to Level 4, which housed the communications center. Every centimeter of the way, he fought with the pain of his wounds, ever concerned for Crystal's and Donnie's safety. With injuries and fatigue nearly getting the better of him, Dr. Dunham reached the maintenance airlock of the communications center. In the near distance, he spotted flashes of light from the shuttlecraft's engines as it cruised closer to Building 5. "Time is still at my advantage," he believed, while hoping he could send the transmission to Earthside Command long before the shuttlecraft could dock and Barris and his mob of miners could disembark. Dr. Dunham peered through the transparent steel window of the airlock and found the facility to be vacant. He thought that to be a bit odd because of all the posts on the station. That one was staffed around the clock. He hesitated for a moment as he struggled with the uneasy feeling of knowingly entering another trap. Nevertheless, he knew he didn't have any other choices. He had to go inside and send the transmission. Chapter 11. The flashes from the shuttlecraft's engines grew brighter, letting Dr. Dunham know he must press onward without delay. All feelings of fear were suppressed as he opened the airlock. Once inside, he sealed the hatch, pressurized the small compartment, and ran the decontamination cycle. As the artificial gravity began to pull down on his body, the pain from his shoulder and knees became nearly unbearable. He almost collapsed under the strain. A green light flashed above him, indicating the decontamination and pressurization processes were completed, after which the hatch allowing access to the communications center slowly yawned open. Dr. Dunham cautiously and painfully limped into the communications center, sealing the hatch behind himself. While tossing his headgear aside, his eyes flickered around, making certain the room was empty. Satisfied he was alone, Dr. Dunham limped over to the transmitting control console. Thoroughly exhausted, Dr. Dunham collapsed into the control chair and took a second to get a grip on his injuries before analyzing the control panel. Someone, whom he figured might still be nearby, had shut down the entire communication system. Without further hesitation, he flipped the power switches to the on position. Humming softly, the control board came to life, displaying a multitude of flashing lights. Dr. Dunham drew in a deep breath and prepared to open a channel for Earthside Command. But suddenly, he became alarmed by the presence of a shadow slowly creeping over him from behind. He shifted his weight to one side and stood as quickly as his wounds would permit. "Barris!" Dr. Dunham cried, thoroughly disgusted by the mere sight of the man. But how did he get here before the shuttlecraft? Barris gave Dr. Dunham a frigid smile. "You're a bloody fool, mate. "You should have listened to me," he said wryly. Dr. Dunham remained silent and perfectly still as he debated whether or not to take a swing at Barris, but he quickly decided against it. Though his spirit was more than willing, his body lacked the strength. Instead, he simply let his gaze bore deeply into Barris's cold black eyes. Barris noticed the hostility in Dr. Dunham's gaze. He was quick to raise his right hand level with Dr. Dunham's chest. Dr. Dunham glanced at Barris's hand and wasn't at all surprised to see Barris aiming a small, stubby handgun. Though his untimely demise seemed inevitable, Dr. Dunham wasn't concerned for himself. His thoughts and feelings were for Crystal and Donnie. Barris would undoubtedly try to silence them next. Dr. Dunham felt a surge of anger burn inside his wounds and his weary heart. He swallowed the stalled breath lodged inside his throat and said, "Well, Barris, I guess it's your move." Barris held the weapon well. His eyes were calm and his hands steady, as though the task of murdering an innocent man didn't seem to trouble him in the least. "Even if you kill me, you'll still have the rest of the station personnel to deal with," Dr. Dunham pointed out. "I'm sure not everyone will go along with your cover-up. What will you do then? Kill them all?" "You underestimate my abilities, Doctor," Barris said with pride. "I'm simply going to handle this little spot of trouble the same way I handled the shuttlecraft adventurer." He seemed all too pleased with himself as he casually leaned against the control console. "Then, once a new company and a new crew are in place, mining shall resume as scheduled. If any of those parasites come close to this station again, they will simply be destroyed. Eventually, with the military support of Earthside Command, I plan to organize extermination parties to get rid of the nuisance quickly and systematically." A look of sheer ecstasy appeared on Barris's face as he raised the stubby barrel of the handgun to Dr. Dunham's nose. Unexpectedly, a towering figure emerged from behind a computer bank and seized Barris. Barris' arms were pinned to his sides by a physical force he couldn't overcome. He fought for air, but like a python, the powerful arms that held him constricted with his every exhale. Soon Barris hung limply in his captor's arms, and his weapon fell harmlessly to the deck. Dr. Dunham recovered from the initial shock and hollered, "Donnie!" The intense fury in the young man's eyes was brutally obvious, and he didn't seem to notice Dr. Dunham pulling at his arms while attempting to break his grip. All Donnie saw was the hurt Barris had inflicted on him over the past year. "Let him go, Donnie," said a soft voice from across the room. Something inside Donnie's heart and mind eased at the sound of Crystal's voice. Donnie let Barris fall to the deck in a heap, and then he turned to Crystal. "Did I do wrong?" Donnie needed to know with tears forming in his innocent, deep blue eyes. Crystal held Donnie close and comforted him as any good mother would do for her child. "No, Donnie," she assured. "You did what had to be done. I'm proud of you." Dr. Dunham's and Crystal's eyes embraced. He wanted to abandon all and hold her tightly in his arms. The loving gaze she returned made Dr. Dunham believe she wanted to do the same. Reluctantly, though, Dr. Dunham turned from the warm, loving eyes of Crystal and painfully kneeled beside Barris. Though unconscious, Barris was breathing freely, but he appeared to have 3 broken ribs. A minute or 2 longer in Donnie's grip might have resulted in fatal injury, Dr. Dunham figured. "Sweetheart, you look terrible," said Crystal as she approached her husband, and then she lightly touched the bruise on his left cheekbone. With Donnie's assistance, Dr. Dunham stood and gave his wife a one-armed hug. "Just another wonderful day at the office," he said at last. "Well, it's all over now, Doc," said a voice Dr. Dunham immediately identified. Startled, Dr. Dunham turned to his left and took notice of Len Marks standing a few meters away. "I wish people would stop jumping out at me like this," he thought. "Did you just come in, Marks, or were you standing there all along?" Dr. Dunham asked, not concerned with the answer. He merely wanted to buy some thinking time. Marks smiled slyly and said, "I hitched a ride on the crew transport with Barris. I was here before you came through the airlock." Dr. Dunham was skeptical. "Funny, I didn't notice you." "That's the whole idea, Doc," Marks said in a manner that sent a death chill down Dr. Dunham's spine. Slowly, Mark's chilling expression changed as he seemed to think about something distant. Then he reached into one of the inside pockets of his overcoat. Dr. Dunham's body stiffened. "Not again," he prayed. He tried to move in front of Crystal as he eyed the handgun Barris had dropped. Marks sensed the tension. "Relax, Doc," he said, bending over and picking up Barris's handgun. He then approached Dr. Dunham and extended his right hand that held a folded scrap of yellow paper. Though relieved someone else wasn't trying to kill him, Dr. Dunham was still reluctant to move. Crystal nudged her husband a bit. "It's all right, Jonathan," she told him. "You really must see this." Dr. Dunham took the scrap of paper Marks patiently held out for him. He unfolded it, and his brow furrowed in confusion. He was speechless as he stared at the detailed sketch of one of the aliens. He didn't understand the significance of the drawing, but he had the feeling it possessed one. He looked to Marks for an explanation. Marks wiped a hand across his mouth and cleared his throat. "My father is the late Colonel Theodore Marks, master and commander of the famed shuttlecraft Adventurer. I found this drawing hidden among his personal ship's log that was retrieved from the shuttlecraft's wreckage. I have to admit, all these years I didn't know what the drawing meant. But then, I saw your little movie doc, and it all made perfect sense." Dr. Dunham passed the drawing back to Marks, and then he retrieved the CD from his pocket. Marks breathed deeply, then continued. "So I guess I can assume that when Barris sabotaged the Adventurer's hull and destroyed every computerized log, he never knew my father's personal handwritten log existed. You mean to say your father knew about these aliens 10 years ago?" Dr. Dunham asked, completely overwhelmed by the culmination of events. Mark shrugged his shoulders. "It appears that way, Doc, and the secret almost died with him, thanks to Barris." There was a brief silence as they glared at Nolan Barris, who remained stretched out on the deck. Marks eventually broke the silence. "I love my father very much. Do you understand that?" Again, they looked angrily at Barris, who groaned in and out of consciousness. "There is no doubt about it," Dr. Dunham reckoned. "Barris will definitely be brought to justice." Marks dropped into a control seat, clapped his hands, and then vigorously rubbed them together. "Well, Doc, I guess we have a transmission to send." Dr. Dunham felt a surge of renewed energy rise inside him. He looked Marks straight in the eyes and said, "That we do."
You have just experienced Star Song by Alan A. Zarbach, narrated via Speechelo. And presented by Midgard and Beyond Books.